All right, it is 5:31 and I'll call the curriculum committee to order. Tonight we have several informational pieces, and then towards the end, one of the things that we didn't put on the agenda but that I'd like to discuss is what business needs to be conducted in July and if we need to meet in July. So I will have, I think it's Pam is going to kick us off with our AGR update.
Sounds good. So just so you're aware, the AGR report, because our Jefferson and Franklin elementary schools receive AGR funding, they are required to, at the beginning of the year, set some goals, and then at the end of each semester, prepare a report to the board. So that's what you have in front of you is the end of the year report. Also, I just wanted to mention that coming to the board on Tuesday will be a request to move forward with another application for a 5-year contract so that we can continue to get AGR funding. It's on a 5-year cycle. And so at the end of that 5-year cycle, schools are required to reach out to the state, fill out an application for the next 5-year cycle. It's a little strange in that the application is for a 5-year cycle, but you take your baseline from the current year and you kind of project forward for the next year. And then every year after that, you continue to do those things. So just a little bit of a different thing, but that will come to the board just for an acknowledgement. Yes, please proceed with moving forward with the application so that we can continue to get the funding. So that's on Tuesday. So what I did, you have both reports from Franklin and Jefferson, and there's a lot of information in there. So I tried to create just a summary sheet that gives you kind of the highlights of the information, because there's a lot of things in there that they are required to report, but not all of it at times is easy reading or makes a whole lot of sense. So Franklin and Jefferson approached it individually. So they set their goals individually. They approach the process of setting those goals individually. And you'll see that in the fact that they focused on some different things. I mean, they have to focus on reading and math at the kindergarten through 3rd grade level. That's required. But in terms of how they go about setting their goals, monitoring their goals, reporting out their data, those are where they have some of that flexibility. And both administrators met with teams of teachers to do that process in the fall. And then again, as they're kind of going through the year, they kept connected with that. That is also true about the application process, that they used a team of teachers to help build their application. So both schools use instructional coaching because we have the math coaches in place at both schools, and we have our reading teachers who also provide some coaching support to the teachers. Instructional coaching really has taken the forefront as our primary strategy, and you'll see that infused in a lot of the work that they've done. The math coach, the reading teachers, the EL teachers, their special ed teachers are all a part of those weekly collaborations with teacher teams and spending time talking about what are we noticing in the data in terms of students that have gaps, and then how can we plan together to address those gaps. There has been a lot of emphasis at Franklin and at Jefferson in PLC teams taking the data and really tracking it over time and making sure that as assessment results are coming in, they're using that data to determine where are students at, are they making progress, and if they're not, how are we addressing that? You'll see that at Franklin, they reference the fact that their teams collaboratively plan learning targets together. And that's something that they were specific to address because they spent some time this year as a building really focusing in on those learning targets. And so part of their collaborative process was to say, when we look at our data and how that's doing it, how are we using that to inform some of those targets that we're setting for students on a daily basis? And then they used their information from their assessments to also help to address students through intervention. And that was targeted intervention that was provided one-on-one in small group. Teachers, classroom teachers doing a lot of intervention for reading, in some cases, the reading teachers also doing some of that intervention. So that is kind of the overview of what Franklin, they gave you a lot of information as well. I asked them, I always like it for the teachers to have a voice in the report because it's kind of just numbers heavy. And so the end of both reports, it gives you a glimpse of what the teachers had to say about the work that they're doing. And so I tried to capture some of those highlights in there for you. So when we look at the data for Franklin looked at trying at the kindergarten level to really look at those early literacy skills, and in particular identified the better sounds piece as a key aspect of how would we know a student is going to be successful. And so they use that letter sounds assessment as their measure for really determining which students had gaps and then how are we progressing with students. And you'll see that they had set a target of 100% of the students being there. A little ambitious, especially in a COVID year. I didn't say, really guys? But they found that they were pretty successful in terms of getting the students on that letter sound assessments to a pretty high level in the fall or in the spring now. But I think one of the things that comes into play this year that we have to keep in mind is they had a population of students they started with on paper, and they didn't get to assess all of their students. For some students, they didn't, interact with or engage with just because of the virtual nature of what was going on with COVID. They tried, but couldn't track down some of the students, and some of the students were inconsistent. And so they did what they could to try to get those assessments in, but they weren't able to assess necessarily all of their students. But they did do a great job of really digging in to try to make sure those early literacy skills were going. For our math, really focused in on Bridges. And in Bridges, there is an assessment that's called a number corners assessment that really gives a profile of skill development for students. And so they looked at, because it's a new curriculum, trying to set that 80% target as a measure. If we get 80% of the students to be proficient, we know we're on track in terms of our instruction, and then it's really more individualized. Because we really didn't have a baseline to use for this year as kind of a measure for a target. They stuck with that in terms of that Bridges assessment. And so at the kindergarten level, they did end up at 78% proficiency on that number corner assessment at the end of the year. And they had another 9% of the students that were close, but not quite there yet. So the other thing that you'll notice in the data for Franklin is that they did two different things. They looked at the whole, all students, and then at the beginning of the year, they looked at the students who did not perform successfully on the initial assessment and called those students their target group. And so they tracked that group of students over time in the course of the year, as individuals to really see, are they closing gaps for those students who at the beginning of the year were identified as really not at proficiency. So just a way to kind of really hone in on who does have an achievement gap when we start the year, and how do we make sure we know those students and we are staying attentive to them. Doesn't mean we don't look at everybody, and keep teaching to the whole, but really try to hone in on that group. So that's what you see as the bullet points underneath, a little bit of reference to how the target group then compared into the whole.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
On all of these, at the very end, it says, for example, under math, for Franklin, under kindergarten, it'll say 10 of the 28 students below target in fall made at least 1 year's growth by spring. So when we say 1 year's growth, what is that in relation to? And does that then make them proficient? What is the distinction there with calling it 1 year's growth?
No,
Why are we calling that out?
That's a great question. So when they took a look at that initial assessment, some students were well below grade level.
Okay.
And so what they looked at was, where is the student at in comparison to where they should be on grade level? And that 1 year's growth represents they aren't quite where they should be, but they have at least enough growth to be consistent with what a student over the course of 1 year would achieve.
Okay.
And the same thing happens, because sometimes when you think about it, not everybody's starting at the same point. So you might have a student that's close to being proficient, but you might also have a student that's pretty significantly behind. And that includes all of our students. So it's special education students, it's our English language learners, all of our students are included in that. So when they look at proficiency, for some students, it seems so far away. right? You know, because they're so far behind. So they're looking at, we want to get as many students to proficiency as we can, but we also want to make sure the students who aren't proficient are growing. And so that was part of their focus, is to try to make sure that even if they weren't at proficiency yet, we were still getting some growth in there. And so they looked at those targets and said, where would a year's growth be? And then how many students are at that point?
And how do we recognize that for our kids though, who are really far behind, say, for example, but they've had a whole year's growth, so that's to be commended, right? They're working hard, they're getting a year in. Are they aware of it, or what do we do to like help encourage them, I guess, to keep going?
Yeah, I
Do
can't
something
speak
special?
to directly, you know, all of that, Kathy. I
Okay.
do know that a lot of our teachers spend time talking with the students as part of that motivation, right? Let's keep working at it because you're getting there, you're getting there. And I know those teacher teams talk quite a bit too about, are we seeing progress? Because if we're not, we have to really then think more about what else could we try, because we're not getting the progress that we need. I do know at Franklin, for example, there were a couple of students that one teacher in second grade was monitoring throughout the year, had multiple conversations with her team, built plans, and wasn't really noticing that students were growing. And so she kept coming back to the team saying, what else can we try? Because little growth was okay, but it wasn't quite getting the student ready. Get that going to talk about those plans, and then, you know, having that conversation about, are there some additional supports that we need? Is this a situation where we may need to look at a special education referral because we have a student who's not making progress when other students who are behind are making progress with some of those same interventions? So, you know, we have great teachers. So, you know, I would say our teachers are great at motivating kids, telling kids, just let's stay with it, keep going. Do I know specifically what every teacher did? No, but
That's true.
I trust them. I know that they do a great job, and so, you know, they use as much tools in their toolbox as they can, both to strategize, but also to keep the kids.
I think we see some of that in the model of instruction and how that lends to individual and small group goals. And then teachers using that time, that small group time, to talk about, hey, you are making that progress, and let's set another goal. And I think we saw that in some of those showcases this year.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about Madison right now, and they talked about, I think they showed a chart where teachers were tracking individual student goals, and they're using that tracking chart to have those conversations with kids.
Yeah, we've had that come up a couple times in Showcase, I think, where they talked about that collaborative time, and how useful that's been.
Right.
So,
And then for grades 1 through 3 for reading, they used, they were looking at doing running records. Typically, we would use like a Fontes and Pinnell assessment at those grade levels. And this year, we didn't have the opportunity to do that. So they utilized running records because they could do those in no matter what model we were in. So when we were virtual, teachers were doing running records virtually, and when we were in person, they were doing them in person. So they looked at that and really tried to move towards proficiency with as many students as possible on that. As you can see, it was more of a struggle this year in getting some of those students to move forward in terms of achieving grade level proficiency in reading. And so they had some growth in terms of their target students, you know, in pockets, but still have some work to do. So this data then will move forward to their planning for next year and taking a look at, okay, we know that we have some students that are going to be struggling as we start the year. How do we make sure then that we ramp up our efforts for that next year? And then math, they looked at the bridges again, that initial screener. They used some of their unit post assessments to really kind of measure progress along the way, and then that number corner assessment at the end to see where students are at. And they did have some success, you know, in that, taking a look at trying to ensure students were getting to proficiency or making that 1 year's worth of growth. And so seeing some good things coming out of their math. But again, you know, it's challenging because we kind of said we have like year 0.5 of Bridges implementation. Because we did some things to Fidelity and other things we had to kind of work through how are we gonna adjust here? Because we're going into a different model or just the scope of time that you had to work with students, so.
It does make me curious about the grade 3 and both reading and math, and I'm wondering if that was consistent with the same grouping last year in grade 2, or if it's a COVID quirky, like we're expecting them to read things that maybe it was more difficult to do virtually because of that age. It's kind of a transitioning reading group at that point. I don't know.
Or a curriculum issue too, though,
That's
because Lucy
right.
was new last year, and how long has Bridget's been here?
It's the first year.
This
The
is
first year.
one.
So now you've got kids who are into it for a couple years, and then that curriculum issue, but there's so many things going on this
There's
year.
too many variables.
Yeah, I was
probably
wondering that
to
too,
pin it
because it's definitely a correlation there with numbers.
We have had the units of study at the elementary a little bit longer than the middle school. So, they would have been several years out from their initial implementation of that. But I don't know, I don't know the specifics on the students here. I do know, when they took a look at that, that's why they were really monitoring that growth as well. Because if we see the same thing next year after we do have more of a consistent year, then it is going to be taking a look at, like you said, Kathy, what else about our practices? I know that a lot of our schools in general are having conversations about that time that Jason's talking about with that conferring. And how do you set a goal with a student that's really individualized to where they're at and kind of monitor them moving forward so that you're making sure each student is individually growing while you're still teaching some of these global concepts at that grade level.
So this just seems like a whole class. I mean,
Yeah,
two
it's
thirds
just-
of the class.
But,
So
sometimes if reading is an issue, it goes
into math and other
to
areas.
other
right?
areas.
So, yeah, it's definitely something that they know they have to monitor. And, the nice thing is, when they set there's targets at the beginning of the year, we'll have some additional assessments that, fingers crossed, we'll be able to do in person at the beginning of the year that we didn't have the ability to do this year. So they'll be able to get another set of data as well to check at the end of summer now. Where are these students, how does that data from the fall when we start the year compare to this data, and bring that together to say, okay, what are we dealing with, and then how do we plan for these students and have hopefully some better outcomes on the end. Thanks. Jefferson, again, a lot of their things are very similar. Couple of things that Jefferson pointed out in their work in terms of instructional coaching and just some of their strategies. They sent materials home, so really made a concerted effort to make sure as they were seeing students' needs, they tried to send things home that aligned to the classroom instruction or aligned to the goals that the student was working on so that families could also get involved. And they did their math coach did some modeling of lessons. So came into the classroom and did some modeling for teachers as well, so that they could kind of see how might you approach teaching. They call them teaching moves, where you start to monitor your student understanding and then make a shift in your instruction in response to that feedback, and then the assessment strategy. So they wanted to point that out as something that they felt was really a part of what their concerted efforts to help address gaps. They approached the reading and the math just a little bit differently. The reading, they took a look at in each of the grade levels with our new phonics units of study that we use. There is an assessment. It's an end of the year assessment that allows you to kind of take a look at where students are at the end of the year in terms of their early literacy skills. So kindergarten was very much the same as what Franklin had in terms of looking at those early literacy, letter, sound kinds of things. But when we get beyond kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, what they did was they gave the previous school year or previous grade levels end of year assessment. So those first grade students took the kindergarten assessment and they said, let's see how many students have gaps based upon they're not proficient on the kindergarten assessment. And then they worked to really make sure they were developing proficiency on that kindergarten assessment. And then in the middle of the year, they gave the first grade assessments to those first grade students and said, okay, now who else do we need to kind of check in because they're not proficient on the first grade. So they did the same thing in second grade. They gave the first grade assessment at the beginning of the year, and then the second grade at the middle of the year. And in third grade, they gave the second grade end of year assessment, and then took a look at those students and moving them forward. They did set some lofty goals. They looked at reading. They looked at trying to have students move forward. 95% of students move forward on that previous grade levels assessment, and then having at least 80% proficiency on that current grade level. And they knew that was lofty. But they were trying to really stretch the students and stretch their teachers to really dig into that work to address those gaps. And they had some pretty good outcomes, but they still have some gaps that they need to address and work through. But I think one of the things that they noticed is that I think by having the teachers dig in, there was a lot more familiarity with those very specific skills and how to monitor during that time when we're working with students on those phonics lessons, how to take some time to fill those gaps during that time. So we have first grade students who don't have the kindergarten skills. We have to find some time to make sure we're building in some of that. And that's, again, what Jason was talking about in terms of some of that time that they built into their day to work in small groups and one-on-one with students gives them a little bit better picture. And having some of the specialists in there allowed them to work with specialists also to help with some of that. So it gave them an opportunity to really get to know that assessment, get to know that instruction that needs to go into that, and then come out with some data that they can then use to feed forward.
So is this the first year we've done this?
This particular piece, yes, Kathy, and it's because we didn't have the typical assessments. So we give something totally different. And I think it was kind of a blessing in disguise because it forced us to think about, well, how would we really want to know, how would we know that a first grade student is ready for first grade, learning and early literacy is developing. And when we said we couldn't do the things that we normally would do, it forced them to think about what other resources and information do we have. And one of the things we came back to was we have this resource that allows us to assess for early literacy skills, teach to those early literacy skills, and then assess our progress on it. And so they made use of that. The other thing that was nice is that when the first grade teacher had a student who was in the kindergarten level, understanding of skills, they went to the kindergarten teacher and said, do you have some resources I can use to help me teach some of these skills? Because I teach first grade skills. So they were doing some of that collaborative work with their teachers.
Are the two schools or can they down the road combine their efforts? I'm just noticing, for example, like Franklin's kindergarten reading program this year seemed very successful at 94%, where you've got Jefferson hanging around the 30s. But then vice versa, you've got the same kind of issue going on for, I think it's, what was it, math? I was just noticing it's almost like in reverse versus the other. Like, can they collaborate too sometimes? Like, I think like Jefferson going to Franklin for kindergarten saying, what did you guys do versus what we did? Because something happened at Franklin that really worked. So like maybe over the summer, they may have time for some of that collaboration too. I don't know how that all works. It's like so much time you can get together, but.
I think the leaders this year, because they had to choose assessments that they've never really used before, they talked to each other, but I don't know if either of them knew how's this all gonna work.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely, as they continue,
Down the
because
road,
they work together, to support each other in this process of, working through the AGR pieces. And so having those conversations about how did you set your goals and what did you use to kind of inform the work that you're doing, and what on the other school, what are you doing, so we can take a look at what's working. So no, that's a great point.
And we do have that type of collaboration occurring now.
Mhm.
So thinking about our math coaches, we have math coaches in both of these buildings and more,
Mhm.
but those math coaches are collaborating regularly about the data, but also planning professional development. And we're working towards that with our reading folks. And then during those professional development days, we at the elementary level grade band people together. So on an in-service day in April,
Yeah.
I think we had one, March, April, K and 1 teachers were together digging into data and planning collaboratively for bridges. So we are putting those folks together now.
I think especially after data comes out like this, that would be really useful too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the essence of the PLC process, right? Is you had something that worked, I didn't. How do we work together to make both of us better? That's really the essence of it. The other unique thing that Jefferson did is in the area of math. They elected to go standard by standard. So they said, at the beginning of the year, they looked at their original power standards and they did an assessment to determine how many students were, where was proficiency level at on those initial power standards. And then as the year progressed, more standards are added, the depth of the standards got more rigorous. They did some continuing assessments over time and just monitored that data. So in the report, the full report, you get to see every standard spelled out. I tried to save that in here, the summary, by capturing some of the highlights. But their intent is to continue to monitor standard by standard because their goal is to try to make sure that at least 80% of the students hit every proficiency on every single standard that's a part of that grade level. And so when we took a look at it and they said, this is what we want to do, I said, again, that is a pretty lofty goal. But, the hesitation is if we set the bar low, how much investment do we make in this? Versus if we set it high, we know that we're going to have to stretch. We may not get through this year, but we're going to stretch and see how far we can get. And, they did have some successes in that. They'd like to have more over time. And so they're going to continue that approach. But that was another opportunity for the coach to engage in their building with the teams of teachers to say, which standard are your students struggling with most? How can we talk about some strategies you might use? Can I model something for you? And so those teams were able to talk very directly about a very specific skill that students were falling short on and try to address it that way. So it was a unique approach, never done that before, but I think they felt like they saw some benefits in taking that approach.
Seems like a good idea, but a lot of assessment going on.
That regular data collection, and regular reviewing and talking about who's got it and who doesn't. That's that ongoing conversation. But and I think we talk about assessment like it's this big thing. Some of these are pretty quick. We do a quick assessment, a quick check of a standard, and then we use that information to say, okay, who has it, who doesn't, address it, and then we move on, and then the next cycle do some more. So, and our Bridges resource does have those opportunities for short assessments, long assessments built into it to give that balance of data. So that's kind of a nice feature as well. Questions? That was a lot.
I have a couple.
Mhm.
When did we start this program? I know you said it was coming up for a 5 year. Has this been implemented for 5 years?
It has been I'm not sure how far beyond that, Stacy. I just know that we've been in a 5-year cycle up to this point.
So is it safe to assume that the third graders on here would have been in this program 2 years ago?
Yes. Yes. Other than students that move in. What I would say is that every year the school kind of sets its direction for this. And so some of the variability in this plan has not looked the same every year previous, and it's not just because of the assessments. It would also be because of the teachers and the building leader who are leading it. But yeah, there would be the same group of students.
And the curriculum may have changed.
Yeah, the math curriculum did change this year.
Okay.
And then we did add the phonics units and instruction at the early grade levels 2 years ago. Okay. So second grade was last year, and then kindergarten and first the year before. But so those are new.
So is it I guess we use the word is it valuable to have, or is there accuracy in a year by year comparison? So if the program was in, 5 years and we go from kindergarten to 5th grade, or we look at these standards side by side, can you compare those?
Through this, I don't know if you can because they've taken some different approaches, but through our global data, we can take a look at some of that. So, at the early grade levels in literacy, we look at PADLs to determine our trends in that. And then at 3rd grade, it's the forward exam for literacy and math. We have used like the Fontes and Pinnell assessment as a way to kind of measure some of those those reading skills as well, the development of those when outside of the time when we have the statewide assessments. Math, we've had an assessment, EMU, and assessing mathematical understanding. That was the assessment we were using for kindergarten through 2nd grade in math to make sure that we were kind of tracking it. We don't have a statewide assessment at that point. And so we were using that and tracking that, but because our curriculum Bridges has a lot of assessment built in, we didn't need to continue using that as a way to get a lot of measures. So our hope is that with this math, we'll be able to do that and track that a little bit better and set up a system by which, we're looking at groups from one year to the next. And we will, as we get the forward data, we'll be able to share that with the board too, so that you can kind of see some of those trends over time.
That was the impetus for, I think I shared the slideshow with you on milestones of success.
Right.
And the goal was for us to really look at that year to year, but also longitudinally. And that was kind of derailed in the last 18 months, but that was the foundation of why we wanted those milestones.
Okay.
So we could target, again, we could drill down to individual students, but also look across grade bands by building, however we wanted to look at it.
And that gives us a sense of just general effectiveness too, because the variables hit, right? They change. And so one year's 3rd grade class to the next year's 3rd grade class is kind of apples to oranges at times. But if we look at the trends over time, we can see, and like you said, take that 3rd grade class and look at, what happens in 4th grade, what happens in 5th grade, how do they do as they get into middle school, and kind of watch over time. We get a better sense of our actual curriculum efforts and how that plays out, because that is more about, the work that we're doing to help close those gaps and address it over time. So as we get more concrete systems of assessment, it makes it a little bit easier to do.
When like at the top of the sheet it says spring, is that, I'm assuming there's one for fall, so fall, spring, and then you said summer, there's one as well?
No, they set the goals at the beginning of the year, and then they will have a report. It typically is about December, it's kind of their fall, it's a little bit off. And so they'll do a report at the end of 1st semester, sometime between November, actually January, because that's the end of the semester.
Okay.
They'll do their fall report and give an update. And then this spring report is called spring, but it really is like May to June, because they're doing their end of year assessments at that point in time. So it's a little off in terms of the naming of it, but that's the state.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So like Pam said, that'll be brought to the next board meeting to approve the next 5-year cycle. So, thank you. Jason, I think you're walking through the commitments. to
Yes,
share
thank
those, right? And
Yeah.
the survey data?
So there's 3 documents included under the category of teaching, learning, and assessment commitments. So I'll just kind of talk us through each of those. The first is the actual commitments, should look something like this. And just some historical,
Mine doesn't have all that writing on it. Is it supposed to?
yeah, we can upload this for
You
later.
may or may not be able to.
Exactly, those secret notes,
No.
and passwords, because you're gonna go, what?
No secrets, if you can decipher them, but, the idea of teaching, learning, and assessment commitments really was born last summer, because there was, we entered and navigated the summer with a lot of questions. And so we wanted to, as a student learning office, enter the year, whether we were in virtual, blended, or face-to-face, making some teaching, learning, and assessment commitments to our students and our parents. So last year, we presented the first round of those commitments to this team, and they were 10 in number. So that's where it came from. So this year, starting around the beginning of semester 2, the student learning office team started to bring people in to talk about the commitments. And we started with those 10, and then it became these seven, right? And so I'll just quickly walk through what each kind of mean and answer any questions along the way. So number one, we talk about PLC, that professional learning community model. And number one really speaks to that. There's 3 tenets of the professional learning community model, and it's collaboration, it's a focus on learning, and it's a results orientation using data. Number 2 talks about an agreed upon scope and sequence and pacing by grade band or course. The grade band really speaks to elementary and middle, and course kind of grabs middle school and high school as well.
I think the goal in thinking about that is no matter where in our district the student is engaging in that course, that we have a consistent kind of scope and sequence and pacing, so that as we're working to try to help students develop proficiency towards power standards, all students are not necessarily getting the exact same experience, but they're getting the same opportunity to engage with those standards over time. So, biology at one school, in our district should look like biology at another school. Math at one middle school should be looking like math at the other middle school. And that's so that, the teachers have the flexibility to instruct, and that's part of the art of instructing. But, kind of those targets that we're setting and as we go through the units, how we kind of engage in those units and pace those units so that every student has the opportunity to get the full scope of things over the course of the year.
I think we have a moral obligation to provide that common experience, but I think it's ever more important, as Pam highlights in the AGR report, this year's 3rd graders are all next year's 4th graders, right? We're seeing changing populations, so that becomes even more important. Number 3, really, again, we start with the standards, and we want that to funnel down to daily learning targets, assessments, and regular feedback around those standards. That's our curriculum. Again, number 4 talks about how do we assess. So we want common, formative, and intro assessments that focus on measuring the achievement of those standards. So a lot of common themes here, right? Standards and assessment, feedback, learning targets.
And that commonality facilitates the ability, like you were talking about, Kathy, before. Let's all bring our data to the table and let's sit and talk about it so that we can share our knowledge. Like, how did you get those results when I gave a similar assessment and I got these results? If we aren't using some of the same assessments, it's difficult for us to have a conversation about what did you do versus what I did. And so trying to really facilitate those great PLC conversations around data and even, across buildings. So thinking about those common assessments across buildings so that when those larger groups come together, they can also have good conversations and take a look at that.
Well, that's the same idea as you talking about offering the same opportunities for our biology all across the board. It's the same idea.
We just had a conversation with a teacher leader that wants to be an SLL an hour ago. He spoke to the power of that work, right? Talking about this year was eye-opening for him because they did bring that common data together, and they realized there are some great things going on, but there are some things we need to change, because they looked at what the learning is, not the teaching. It's about the learning. How are we measuring that? And then how do we grow together as professionals? So it's powerful. Number 5, again, is just that frequent feedback should be aligned to those targets. And we want to make sure that when we talk about learning targets, we talk about 2 pieces: a big idea, what's the big concept of the day, and then success criteria. We talk about I can, right? I can articulate something. I can demonstrate something. So we want those daily learning targets to be the foundation of the feedback we give to those students. How are you doing? What's next for you? What's next for you?
And that gets at what you were asking about, Kathy, is do the kids know?
Right.
Yeah, we would hope so, because that's part of that learning target development, is to say, those I can statements are not for the teacher. You know, they do provide a little lens for the teacher as a reminder, like, I gotta assess this skill because I've got it up there for the kids, but it's really about the kids. And I think at some of our secondary level where the students are really able to kind of speak to that, when teachers do that effectively, the students are self-assessing. They're able to self-monitor and self-correct some things ahead of time in that class lesson, because they're using those as their guide. Is what should I be able to do by the time we leave here today? And so just that language is really important.
Number 6 really just talks about classroom environment that's rigorous, ambitious for all, and provides that equitable access. It ties to number 2, right? We want some common experiences for all. And we talk about positive identities and agency. And we really want to develop positive identities in all learners. And that's just allowing learners to see themselves as doers and makers of sense in the content, right? We want students to see themselves as mathematicians, and we want them to see them as artists. So we want them, so that's what identity speaks of. And agency really speaks of confidence and capacity and willingness to engage in the content inside the classroom and outside. So those 2 things working together creates a pretty cool learning experience for all learners. And then number 7 just talks about our commitment to partnering with families. That we know that we're a huge component in learning, but so are the families, and that's that commitment. So something that's different, the next piece that you'll see in the attachments, something different this year was we wanted to get some feedback from as many people as we could. So that team that came together to look at the commitments and revise them also worked to create this rating system. So it really talks about a rating of 5. This is a great, I have the capacity to make it happen, all the way to a 0, and that's, I kind of don't even understand that commitment and everything in between. So we created a Google form or survey that went out to the entire staff, I think second to last week of school. And it showed the commitments, showed the rating scale, and asked everyone to kind of rate themselves. And then the last piece there is the data. So we had 143 folks take the survey. And again, that rating scale, as the first attachment shows, 0 to 5, and the percent of folks of where they rated themselves. The only identifying marker we asked was, what's the homeschool that you identify with? Because we wanted to take this data and share it with our building leaders as they work this summer to look at data, a whole lot of different data sets, this one being included, as they develop their action plans for next year. So you'll see that, I won't go through each of these, but what I looked at was rating 4 and 5. Ratings of 4 and 5 are pretty high level on these commitments, right? Commitment 1, we have 81.8% of folks saying, yep, I can see myself that, and I can see where it fits into my work. And commitment 2, we have 81.1%. These are celebrations. And commitment 3, we have 74.8 that rated themselves between a 4 and a 5. And this was cold, right? We just sent the survey. Here are the commitments. Here's the rating. Rate yourself. Commitment 4, between 4 and 5, 74.8. Commitment 5, 76.4. Commitment 6, 79.7. And then the last commitment is a 72.7. So again, we'll take this data, share it with our building leaders in the coming days and weeks here, and we'll expect them to take a look at that by building as one piece of what other data sets as they start thinking about their action plans.
One thing I have to tell you is this is really hard to follow because you only had commitment 1, 2, 3, 4. Like if you would have included what that commitment was,
Sure.
because it's a whole different like file to go back and forth between. It made it really difficult because really it just looks like we're just staring at a bunch of numbers right now. So maybe in the future that could be slotted out into each commitment,
Absolutely.
but literally spelled out would be helpful.
Sure. Questions about the commitment?
Will the commitments be the same for the next school year?
I would hope that they stay the same, but we'll go through a similar process, right? We'll bring some teacher leaders and building leaders together, talk about their feedback, and have a conversation about do we change them, and if we do, why would we change them?
And I think we went from 10 to 7 because some of them addressed virtual learning
Absolutely.
this past year, which was some of that modification.
I think number 1 was like update your Google Classroom.
Right, or I'll record my sessions or whatever it was,
So
yeah.
we're hoping not to get that one, but I'm thinking 1 through 7 are pretty solid. But
That was
we'll
max,
go through that continuous improvement model every year and talk about it.
And it does give us the ability to track the data. We talked about that historical data and see, part of our interest too is to know, yes, we want to know the 4s and 5s, but we also want to know how many folks do we have that are floating somewhere, and how do we make sure that, that's a need, right? There's something that's needed there that we are really trying to look at that and plan around professional development that might be needed, additional supports that they may need at, in their classrooms or their building levels to really make sure more people are moving towards that end where they're feeling pretty confident with these things. So.
We also share these commitments with folks that we bring into the district to provide professional development. So we do a lot of partnering with CESA 6 and 7, and those folks, when they come into the buildings or our district, have seen these. And it just provides a common foundation of discussion when they are engaging with our professionals.
Are those things that eventually may be presented during the hiring process so that folks know this is, first of all, what I'm getting into, but second of all, just like the higher standards that we expect coming in?
Absolutely. That was not specific to hiring, but part of the conversations when we started thinking about this year's was that we could have and should have done a better job getting feedback and letting people know across the district. So that was, the goal is to have that lead into things like hiring, have that lead into conversations about educator effectiveness, and have these be the foundation of a lot of conversations.
Yeah, you bring up a good point because when we think about like our job descriptions, there's always that part of, that kind of explains a little bit about the specific job, but then there's all this general category about like just your professional responsibilities. Right? These are really what we're saying are the professional responsibilities. So thinking about how can we incorporate those into those job descriptions so that folks know, like you said, we are going to look for these kinds of qualities in the people that we hire so that we can make sure that they're able to fit in, with the other staff members that are in the
And I
building.
would think that would be attractive to quality job seekers.
Absolutely. We think about, we try to communicate the why, the what, and the how all the time. And I think this front sheet that I can give with my cheat sheet notes here is our mission, vision, and core values are really our why. Our commitments are our what, and then our milestones is our how. How do we measure that? So we're really framing it in a way that people expect us to communicate as well.
How did you say this was presented to the staff they did at the beginning of the year? Or?
That was one of the things that I think we learned that we could have done better.
Okay,
So last summer that, some folks came together to create, we shared with principals, asked principals to share. We found gaps in that, quite honestly. So this year we emailed these out kind of cold, right? We didn't tell anybody this email was coming, shared the commitments, and then asked them to do that Google survey, which we received the data.
so they didn't know throughout the whole year that this was what they.
Yeah, these are for next year,
Right.
so,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, got it.
And we'll bring it back as the start of the year unfolds here.
And I thought you said something about parents. Do parents get this as well?
That's another area that we could have done better. So we'll think about it as a student learning office team in conjunction with our building leaders, how they bring not only the commitments forward to parents, but also their goals for the year. So it's one of the things I wrote down about July possibly, right? But every building creates an action plan. And that action plan is developed with the leadership team collaboratively over the summer. And in August, Pam, Jen Schultz, our reading person, Laura Williams, our math person, and myself will sit with each of the teams to review their action plans for the year and also talk about communicating of the plan with parents, students, and staff. So it's something that we know we have to do better, and we have a system to do that.
All right, the last thing on our agenda that I just asked Jason and Pam to share is some of the professional development opportunities, maybe not specifically what they are, but just the fact that we're offering those to our teachers throughout the summer and some of that participation.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I would say for the last 3 years, the Student Learning Office team has had a vision of creating a catalog. And so this is the result of that dream. And so this is our first attempt at it. We've always had some professional development opportunities throughout the summer, but this was, again, a way to systematize that and do a better job of communicating those opportunities. So similar to the commitments, Pam and Jen Schultz started working around the turn of semester, getting feedback from teachers and administrators about the professional development that they would most need or want this summer and next year. And Lori Williams and I went on tour and did the same thing around math. Just brainstorming what do you need? What would be the best format? How would that connect from the previous work to summer and beyond? So this really reflects the culmination of those conversations. And so this catalog went out to the entire MPSD staff, I think fair to say later than we wanted to, but it went out late April, I think. And really just chronicles different opportunities that folks can engage, different by content, different by format, different by outcomes. And so right now we have 87 people that have signed up for one or more of these experiences. They're facilitated, as you can see, by a vast array of folks. Some people that are in our district, teachers, some folks like Lori Williams and Jen Schultz, also some of our CESA representatives. And the learning has already begun. Some of these are Google Classroom experiences where the learning is online, personally, individually, and then they'll come together throughout the summer and talk about the learning. Some of them are in August, for example, there's a math experience where people will come to build it. So again, we want varied experiences, varied outcomes, and varied formats. Our hope and dreams and aspirations would be this catalog becomes bigger every year. And it reflects things like social studies and electives and science and bless you, and a wide array so we can just engage our adults in learning really all year.
And you'll see that there's some specifically targeted more at new teachers coming in, because we've also had conversations about how do we get new teachers up to speed on the journey? Because, you know, like for Bridges, for example, you know, the elementary have about 0.5, maybe 0.75 of year one under their belt. But how do we then have a brand new teacher come in and they're, you know, starting from behind? And so trying to really find a way that isn't too overwhelming for them, that we don't say, hey, welcome to our district, and now you've got all of these opportunities that you have to participate in over your summer before you start with us. You know, just really encouraging, you know, some opportunities for them to engage. And that's why we use Google Classroom as a way to allow them on their own time to do some of that learning, but with some support from some of our facilitators to check in, make sure any questions they have are answered along the way. So that's been a key piece. And I think this year too, we tried to be mindful of the amount of time folks might need to get away and just enjoy, you know, some time away to regroup. And so I think over time, we definitely can grow those opportunities. We do have some teams, we have each of our buildings was allotted some dollars to, within their building, allow folks to, you know, kind of say, I'd like to work on this curriculum project, or we'd like as a team to dig into this, and can we have some time over the summer to do that? And so there are other groups that are going to need to do some of that, but this was our more formalized opportunity, and the buildings are navigating some of those others. So we've got a social studies group that's going to get together and work on some learning targets for their social studies. I know there's some traveling teachers in music that have said, we'd like to make sure everybody who travels is up to speed on the standards for those grade levels that they're working, because they're traveling to multiple different grade bands. And so they want to spend some time digging into that and making sure their teams are up to speed. So they've kind of initiated that, and we've just facilitated it with giving them some opportunities to do that. So
Those are in addition to those leadership groups coming together, look at these. So, you know, our professionals are really engaged all year round. And I think, you know, 87 seems small, but it's a celebration. We have 87 people, in addition to all those other things, that want to continue to learn, even despite a year and a half of pretty tenuous work. So we have much to be proud of.
absolutely.
Any questions about those opportunities?
Are these asynchronous classrooms, the Google? I mean, are they like they're coming in from 9 to 5, I guess is what I'm saying, versus they can do it on their own?
They do classroom on their own, so the Google Classroom is set up for them to learn at their own pace. Each opportunity has a facilitator who's going to connect with the cohort group. So they'll do some learning, and then they'll set some time to come together and talk about it. You watch this lesson on workshop. Let's talk through, what do you understand about workshop and how you're going to implement it in your classroom if you're a brand new teacher who's never experienced it before. It felt like that was more manageable than saying you have to be here on these set days, because that, has said people, we can't force them. And so people have just said, no way. But this, I can sit on my lawn chair outside when I'm drinking my coffee in the morning and engage in it, makes it a little bit easier.
Weirdness, a significant amount of folks are teaching summer school options.
Absolutely.
True. Didn't think about that as well, right? Yeah.
Is there, how was the content developed for each one of these areas? Is it the person that's facilitating that did it?
Yeah, we have some resources that we pulled just from some of the experts that we've worked with, but then our teams of facilitators or teacher leaders have come together and said, this is what is needed. So they looked at it from the lens of, I'm a brand new first grade teacher in this district. What do I need to know about the reading units and stuff? And so that person went through and said, I'm a brand new first grade teacher. I need this, 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 and this to get the year started so I can feel confident. And so try to allow them to have that expertise. They're doing it every day.
And is it more reading or videos or both?
Both.
Yeah,
With
reflections, a lot of reflections to say how you're going to think about applying this in your classroom.
think I want to take one.
All right. So that's the end of our agenda. I did want to have some discussion, and I don't mean to put Jason on the spot, but I did want to discuss if a July meeting is needed. You know, we've had a great year of informational pieces, which I think were necessary. And I've learned a lot this year, alongside everybody else. But I also want to make sure that we have things. Are there things we need to move forward on in July, or should we look at August? And I'm open to either or, but I just want to be conscious that there's downtime that may need to be needed.
Are there any massive, like, or large curriculum changes that are going to be taking place at all this year? Okay, so we don't have to look at that. Oh, yeah. Okay.
You know, as we mentioned, I was just writing some things down. There's nothing new, you know, but things that I think Pam and I have talked about are, I just think about the action plan. So building, you could show in July, not completed action plans, right? So the forms, but that's not
Yeah.
timely.
You can email us though.
Yes, right. So again, if there's nothing new, but we could do any array of updates. Nothing that couldn't wait till August.
Okay. Well, yeah, so if there's no actionable business, then let's take a month off and then regroup in August. And if you foresee something different than that, then we can certainly entertain.
I think the official calendar invites end either this month or next. So I'm just wondering if, I think this is the third Thursday, is that right? Does the third Thursday next year work for everyone around this time? If so, I would just send calendar invites so we have that. So 5:30 p.m. third Thursday starting in August.
That works.
Yeah, I think that's fine for me too. I third Thursday.
Yeah, I've scheduled
I
all
think
my
I'll be here
classes
in
on
August.
So I'll send an invite, just third Thursday, 5:30 p.m. August to June. And then we can have a similar conversation next June.
Sounds good. All right, then I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Adjourn.
Are you really the only one who has to say aye? Technically.
Thank you very much.